So I'm feeling nostalgic for our strategic talks, and that we will resume hopefully soon in a theoretical sense, not just through the resumption of the Funkriege, but properly with ad hoc themes, topics to be explained. I should explain you still after 4 years now what Schwerpunkt actually is, what the Schwerpunkt actually is, and we will make multiple videos on that. Not, I don't know whether soon specifically or not. This depends on, because I like to somewhat create an audience that sometimes it's unaware of these things, to eventually come up with them, and but at the same time, from the other side, I have to make sure that the things doesn't become too lax, so that when I talk about these things, people do not get surprised at the point and say, oh my god, what kind of channel did I subscribe? So I would like to today I made another video, but it was very short, and so I thought to upload another one, and commenting on one question that was posed, that it's not a usual question and answer video, but I appreciate these things, and somebody asked it, and so I'll present it like a general video, a short one, hopefully, as we already see, instead of me that I'm still recording, that I don't know it yet. And that has to do with the evolution, let's say, the history of warfare, given that we fundamentally talk about this, and that's what we head towards in general. So the idea is that we live in a world where strategic education is practically non-existent. You can argue that, well, it would be interesting to make a historical point, how to explain when and how strategic education that existed, at least in the form of a shared art, at least at levels that were, in times where the average person was, however, brought against the harsh reality of realizing harsh reality of war, and how to cope with it, right? And so how this was gradually taken away from us at the point that we don't properly understand the parameters anymore. But there's also, of course, the realization that the majority of people didn't really have a strategic education in a broader sense, at least to lead an army or to wage a war in the first place, and so that's a more complex thing. Arguably, that never existed. I mean, and so it's normal that at a popular level, this is not common knowledge. But at the same time, the world does talk a lot, and talks ever more, because we arrived to this point, we can afford that, in which we are struggling to, after this incredibly rapid and violent coming to the fore of the masses, to the need of disciplining them, of training them, right, of giving them something theoretically valid to, first of all, to understand, because the masses are not just like the elite, but properly to make them understand, because you should explain them in ways that they can understand, that works, that is scientific, that is moral, and that is not just babbling on the internet. And this cannot happen but through a historical education, because the alternative would be to be a militaryman, or at least to have properly a military education of some sort. And again, as before, even going to war actually gives you a very small understanding of what war is, right? There is nothing strange in saying today that military historians understand war for what it is in general better than the average military man. This is not a provocation, this is actually real, right? Because not only not all military men are chief of staff, but you'll be surprised by how many in the same are actually devoid of a correct and formal military education, and properly about the fundamentals of warfare. Von Clausewitz explains us that military practice, even properly, is the only way of knowing what war is, and he would know better. Today we don't live in a world where we make much of war on a large scale for such capacities to be acquired, and this is even actually a problem. We would not hopefully need to make more wars to find that out, but there is always a need to send at least observers. That is what from Clausewitz advises wherever a war is fought and all these things, because of understanding properly what is that, as we'll see now, also changes throughout the eras and how important that is. Of course, in this sense, we don't have much to teach all the various experts on what they have to do. The problem that we constantly, point out is that there is an excess in the proliferations of specialties and in the incommunicability between the same, and sadly enough, in this sense, the multiplication of alleged specialists per se, without even understanding anymore what's the broader heuristic point of something like that. We witnessed this, for example, in the proliferation of strategic studies centers, things like these. And when you go to look at what these people do, they don't actually study anything military. And you would question, how do you think you can acquire strategic capacity if the strategic capacity is something you think is, reading the news, analyzing policy, or studying how many troops are here or there, and then not even having studied how they actually operate, and they should operate in combat. That is also, again, something that you don't see really every day, even properly to analyze on a decent scale, and ignoring basically all history. That is this continuous, military event that presents us with the elements that makes us understand what war is in general, which is of a universal nature and not at all something specific to a single time or era, which is the mistake that we continuously do whenever we want to properly become, we have to understand warfare, you have to differentiate. Differentiating, hyper-specializing is the, even properly in a scientific education, the proof that you're still, of being beginner, or being somebody who needs to concentrate on these individual things because still doesn't understand what the whole thing is about, right? Advancement, expertise comes when you actually are able to read this thing comprehensively, and when you're aware, of course, of the differences, of the importance of the differences, but at the same time, you can read them in a comprehensive fashion. So the whole scientific culture is going in the opposite direction currently, and even though we are finding out that there is a problem, the problem is not much, the problem is that we are creating ever less people who are able to understand that, so that even those who realize this actually become irrelevant to a certain degree in the debate and in the scientific process in the first place. There is yet another big issue that is in fact more peculiar to our culture, and that is the sad presence of culturalism in our military historical horizon. That is to say, this poison that has been injected because of sheer ignorance, narcissism, and hysteria, I don't even know, complexes of inferiority, whatever, in the Western world. The rest of the world has nothing to teach the West, frankly, because the West has already taught that to the world, and the problem, if anything, is that to the world itself, and the problem is, if anything, is that the West is forgetting it, right? And so just even to have a comprehensive understanding of what things these actually mean. But I made videos about culturalism. As you know, I despise it thoroughly because I believe the only way to be a culturalist is to be a racist, fundamentally. And it's basically the assumption that war is not a universal human phenomenon that we're basically programmed to make, and that we have therefore to implement our understanding of in order to wage in ways that are positive. And so that bring to positive and not to disaster, is the belief, in fact, that whoever makes war is a barbarian, right? That war is fought by the most emotional, barbaric, primitive, violent elements of our community. That it's almost something biological in a sense, and this is not just, in my view, just an abomination of all Western culture and world culture, for what we have already explained extensively, von Clausewitz being the first, and to this day unmatched and unmatchable standard that culturalism has completely distorted, chewed, cut to pieces in order to confuse people that of course are too ignorant to study the von Krieg and to even understand what that is about, to make them believe that there is this light in the darkness that guides you, makes you understand how things really are, actually presenting you with some disgusting ideas, such as the one of culturalism, that is actually a product of 20th century cultural decadence, not much of anything, of any improvement by any stretch of the imagination in scientific culture, especially as far as military history is concerned. Culturalism, I would say, you see, technologism is stupid. Culturalism is evil, right? If you believe that war is about technology, you're basically an idiot. If you think that war is basically about culture, that is to say, war, the act of war, the fact of going to war and making war and wanting to go to war is based on some personal taste, fundamentally, that makes you essentially more distant to a civilization that would be allegedly be something more pacific in nature, you're probably an evil person. Because you're trying to deliberately confuse and to deny your own nature in itself, which is something much worse, right? I will not digress properly on the abomination of culturalism per se, but I'll just warn you about the fact that many people who are allegedly experts about warfare, which they are not, because one thing you claiming that, and another thing is actually buying to that, and they buy to that because they think there is some kind of reverence that you must owe to scholarship per se, without even having in fact morally and scientifically scoped it with your own autonomous means, which for many people who are just anxious to follow, to become the next establishment in the form of abuse of power, whatever, is of course the goal, because they don't have any interest in knowing or learning or anything. It's just in whatever they can cash from it, and of course we will let the angry people deciding whether they want to be moral beings or just the next socially envious parasite, for that matter. But sadly enough, this is in fact how the two things meet, right, in the political arena, and that you would just be surprised of how this happens in the military one as well. So if you want to study warfare, it's obvious that you have to do it in a comprehensive fashion at some point, right? You cannot just study a war or becoming just an expert in one war and pretending that you have a strategic education. By itself, you don't have it. As I often say, it is as if you were to study just your own country's history and pretending that you know your country's history. Not just you don't know the one of the rest of the world, but you don't know the history of your own country, because you don't have any comparative capacity to determine how valid it is what you think you know in the first place. The study of war has to be diachronic and comparative, and especially when we talk about the art of war. That is, again, you can study about military history in general, and therefore study, I don't know, how war influenced this or that, or what was the propaganda at the time, but that's just circling around the only thing that actually matters in the history of war, that is how war was made. And that's what the art of war actually studies, to the point that if you shouldn't be able to lead an army in campaign or in battle, you should at least know how that was done. And until you don't if you don't do this properly, you don't really have much of an idea what war factually is. And this is not the emotionalistic side of the story, the perspective. Let's look at war from the perspective of this side, because there are new things that you can make. This is properly, if you already do that, you're doing the same mistake. I see this because this type of videos are flourishing on YouTube. Let's look at war from the perspective of that guy. Let's add another bit of moral relativism to the collapse of scientific education in the globe. Let's study the whole freaking thing, right, and understand in that sense what the perspectives of the both were, because studying things from a single perspective is just narrowing it down. For somebody who, of course, by the way, will not surely be educated by a YouTube video on what normally wars are about, per se, because, again, they don't study the art of war. But, of course, will erase also the fact that there is another person they're fighting against. Even when you present the obvious reality that war is fought against somebody, well, this thing of narrowing things down to the detail, to the corners, or to the thing, is going in the exact opposite direction of what the study of war should be, right? What primarily is, in fact, that is a moral struggle between two forces that influence each other reciprocally. All along the way, and so not like a set trend of conditions that brings to that result, but a situation which is in constant change, right, and can bring to victory and defeat for you quite easily, as much as for your opponent, as the thing is reciprocal. This concept of war as a the art of war is compared. You see, it's not just about the war in itself. Our mistake that is often done is to study war indeed just from the strictly, let's say, from the moment war is waged to the one, properly the guns cease, right, to fire, and that's also not feasible, but not in the way that people usually tell you. You have to understand this. You have to understand war is only important in function of politics and society. Not at all. If that is true, it's also because politics and society individually are important only in function of war, right? It's part of the same thing. It's the close of its in Trinity, right? We don't study war. One of the greatest mistakes you can do is thinking that evidential history is outdated. There are people out there who are obsessed with this terrible idea that you have to study war just in a socio-economical sense because the schwerbach is bad and it doesn't explain you what war is. As a matter of fact, the result of that current, which is of course a materialistic one aimed at erasing any kind of moral dimension from the world, is lacking, of course, a properly strategic education, exactly in the moment in which it cuts away the decisions that in war are done from a strictly military point of view, with a strictly military logic that you must understand in any circumstances. Even if it doesn't matter whether you like it or not, nobody cares about what you like. Reality doesn't care about that. You have to study reality. Reality doesn't give a shit about you and your opinions. That's the point. If you don't study that, you cannot understand why wars go the way they do. Wars do not go the way they do because of some odd structural reason through which you can sort out like a rabbit from a hat and say, that the war had to go like that. That's the first proof that you don't know the art of war. You never studied it. You don't know what it is. You don't know how to apply military logic in the first place. And you pretend other people to following that because, you can't bend it to whatever your ideology fundamentally is about to prove or disprove some kind of ideas. Conversely, this doesn't mean that there aren't factors that are sometimes overwhelming. There is a disgusting proliferation, for example, of softly biased pro-Axis videos on YouTube, because there is a prevalence towards that. That I'm a conservative, even right-wing, let's be honest, and yet I find that disgusting, because that's, of course, ethno-nationalist, and that means, essentially for the cerebrated masses, and it has nothing to do with moral scientific education in the first place. and that say, look, if the Germans had done this in the Eastern Front at this point, they could have won the war, because, you look at all this all this infinite mechanism that doesn't take in consideration any historical problem or interpretation or difficulty for us to understand what the strategic situation was. Banally, we don't even have basically the Soviet archives that are yet to be opened, largely telling about the story. So whatever. And so the Axis could have won. Everybody cheers and say, yay, that's the cool thing. If you tell these kids that Germany had lost the war by November 1941, and you have to make them understand why, and that they will not accept it, you can understand even in there that these people do not know anything about the art of war. They do not study military history. They just listen to, cartoon-like YouTube videos that want to essentially tell them what they want to hear, nothing else. The problems here are deeper. Of course, we cannot explain deeply how, for example, how wrong the technologistic bias is. That is very common, as a matter of fact. It's probably the hardest, the most rooted in people's minds. It's culture is already for people that kind of want to go beyond and make a lot of sophistry and relativism about, and because they understand this, they start reading culturalist literature, and they believe they have found who knows what, and they just get essentially still narcissistically connected to it in a way or another, without again studying the art of war. But how often you hear these phrases, that the pseudo-intellectual attitude of we should highlight how the evolution of war is not only due to technological factors but also to cultural ones. What a deep realization, right? We feel all elevated by these ideas. As if, first of all, considering technology as, Wu said, again, you say yourself, because you don't know what you're talking about, that war should be just due to technological factors. Have you ever studied history of technology? Do you know how technology works, history of science? Do you know that, technology is essentially just a mean to an end, and that are, doctrines that make technology, not the other way around? Or at least they do, but for a minimal margin, not nearly decisive enough. These are the same people that, again, will quote you, but look at World War I, the machine guns and the shelling, and they still will not understand, because, of course, they focus on the tip of the iceberg, what they see in video games. They don't understand strategy, again. They don't understand the connection with politics, again. So they cannot even understand that a stalemate in World War I, from of millions and millions of soldiers from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps was not due to the fact that people had machine guns, but to the fact that there were two freaking countries like France and Germany, and and others that were balanced in that political and only secondarily properly military balance that you don't find, in fact, in the Eastern Front, you don't find in Mesopotamia, you don't find in Africa. And this, people will usually react by saying, but technology is important. How can you say technology is important? It's just that it's not as important as you think, because there are something that is overwhelmingly more important than that. And you don't want to see it. You eliminate it from the equation. You consider just, again, the tip of the iceberg without the iceberg in itself, and you pretend to make it absolutistically and therefore relativistically all about that. So it's a very severe mistake for any person who wants to claim to have any minimal military historical expertise to claim something like that war is basically made by technology. The technology is even, something that even reaches, a half of the, what the military balance is about, or properly meaning also that the war altogether in a political sense is based on what the balance is made. Technology doesn't reach, it reaches minimal, and I want to stress this. This depends in different contexts, but it's really minimal. Also considering that technology normally is matched by other technology, so that makes it even less important, and that makes other things from which the technology depends more important, obviously enough. But that this kind of mental flexibility or complexity apparently is, that I would attribute easily to a ninth grader is too much out of the reach of a lifetime of an adult person. And the other aspect is that the cultural one, that is severe. That is, war is not, say, culture is a term that you can use in various terms, and that of course is is somewhat vague, because what is culture at the end of the day? Is it a sum of these knowledge and in a rationalized and not rationalized sense about the community about which you live? It's something deep, of course. It touches one point. You know that on Schwerpunkt we talk culture all the time. But there is something more precise that the Clausewitz and Trinity highlights. That is, the military element goes in parallel with the political and social one. Now, I will not digress, and I made it in other videos, on how much this is real. And if you have ever made a serious scientific study, comprehensive one, on hundreds, thousands of sources for years to reconstruct a certain military context, how much the political and social one seem almost axiomatically, as an equation, mirror the military one at all levels. That's because, of course, the political, social, and military element in some sense are already the same thing. And again, they're trying to differentiate it. Is a mistake, right? It's a certain mistake that we don't have to forget. Culture, in this sense, doesn't quite exist per se, right? There are other people who are in love, for example, Big Hansen, for example, and the fame that he has, and great historian, good historian, I'd say, it's a great historian, great figure, he wrote a lot, etc. But there are mistakes in his work, and there are mistakes in many great historians' work, so that we are thankful to them for what they write, but doesn't mean that we have to agree. And on the contrary, we shouldn't even start from this attitude that you really don't have to agree with anybody, because again, especially if you're being taught by somebody, one thing is, you're being told something that at some point you should be able to master yourself, because that's the point of an education. You have probably to be led out of a condition of ignorance to be able to investigate further, in theory to be brought at the same level of what your teacher knows, right? And given that most people, of course, do not do this, and of course these people remain academics and scholars, they don't really, you don't really reach them, because you're doing something else in your life, and often at a lower level of inquiry. For you, these people can become just like icons, like superheroes, whatever. I don't have it much against Hansen. I don't have much of animosity towards them. Of course, there is something there that is even a cultural bias that properly in the mistake I can recognize, all a background, all an illusion, even properly a scientific tradition that I don't like particularly. And thus, to the question, does for example, a Western art of war exist as any other, Chinese or whatever art of war does exist? Of course it does not exist, that it never existed, it will never exist. The art of war does not belong to a culture, or to a people, or to a state, or whatever. The art of war is just how you have to make war in this physical world that does not admit alterations. Even when it fights in wars in very different contexts, fundamentally shows you, if you have the patience to actually study it, always the same thing. And so what you actually gain from all those various different contexts, it's not your tiny cellar where you can be just the expert about the thing, but it gives you the capacity to realize the pattern that exists universally in the way humans make war, and why they make it, and how they make it, independently, paradoxically, from the contingencies. Because there is a statistic value in there, and a scientific one, you can realize quite easily that certain dynamics do not really pass. And that's the reason why so many people, for example, study von Clausewitz, and as an alibi they say, but von Clausewitz was writing in the early 19th century. So he's talking about early 19th century warfare. Things have changed. Von Clausewitz didn't know about airplanes, didn't know about spaceships and all these things. Doesn't mean anything. If you think like that, it's because you haven't studied von Clausewitz, and any serious student of von Clausewitz knows that. Even when they think that maybe von Clausewitz, because von Clausewitz is not, it's not easy to accept, right? It's not much that he's not easy to understand, because you have to make the terrible work of studying something in your life instead of just reading and pretending and not even know what you're talking about, of course, which requires time, work, dedication, and so energies and so on. Too much for the average person, in a qualitative sense, not to feel offended, to be an idiot, fundamentally, because people can break their backs in the most terrific physical works. Of course, being an intelligent person is a very different thing, and von Clausewitz is for intelligent people, and von Clausewitz explains you how he is perfect. If anything has read, and we have read it, how he is perfectly aware of cultural differences, what he's always accused not to be of. He perfectly knows what ancient classical warfare was. He perfectly knows what the labyrinth of lordships in the mobs in the early medieval times was. He perfectly knows what happened in the modern age. He perfectly teaches you how the art of war evolved throughout the 18th, the 19th century. He lived those things himself, and he knew those things, not just because he was a military man, but also because he was a historian, and also a very good one, and also he was a scientist, and also he knew basically everything about the world, and he would write for everyone. So speaking a universal language that unfortunately, fortunately, first of all, we have been blessed with between the end of the 18th and the early 19th century in some fields, because also Satan emerged from that same world, and to see what we have turned into now again, and also culturalism is a product of that. But in fact, everything that has come later has somewhat refused to acknowledge it, and has either distorted it or misinterpreted it on purpose, and left people with this impression that we are in a sort of terrible world where you have to abandon yourself to fatalism, to these terrible forces of the unknown. The things are complex or complicated. Nobody really knows. When a scholar or scientist in any case tells you that it's complex, it's complicated, we don't know, we have to, it's because either he or she doesn't know what they're talking about, of course, or they don't have time. Hell, I do it even myself. Should talk about this, but it's complex, complicated now. Yes, because I can't talk for 8 hours rather than the 2 ones that I usually make videos on. Saying we will talk about this, we will figure that out. It's properly a moral attitude that you should have towards existence. Otherwise, you will evolve, right? Like a maggot. You will not see the light. You will not elevate yourself. You will not self-improve. You remain where you are, and you will die a worse person. So all this thing, where does it really go? Because again, in fact, this video is not really meant to be too revelatory. It's still somewhat cryptic in concept. The point is, what should you do to provide, let's say, your properly to understand military history in a comprehensive, complete, scientific sense? Is something that I've been asked, and I've already made videos on. But there is this aspect we could stress a little bit more. That stresses specifically on the concept of how peoples make wars, right? This is also my usual rejection of the concept of geopolitics, at least properly in the meaning that we can still identify, in fact, a way of making war, or a single mentality, or a single control, or a single unity, even in the major powers that operate in the world, because this power is actually composed by lots of other interactions that do not actually overlap with that are not granitically embodying that are not meant even to exist per se, and that instead people kind of instate their own historical, political, worse in fact, political vision on, right? Because that's the first thing you have to understand in war, that not just war is literally a continuation of politics with other means, but that politics changes and in fact depends on other things, including war and including society, that in turn depend on each other in the same way. And so these things change, also in ways that we cannot really control. And so unless we study these specific things, we cannot really understand that. And also, how do you study culture, first of all, if you don't properly, if you attribute it this kind of comprehensive revealing character of it? What is culture, and how do you explain culture when you have to, I don't know, explain that the Peloponnesian War or the Second Punic War? How do you explain cultures by like the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Carthaginians, if you don't even understand the inherent differences and divisions and contrasts existing within those same cultures, right? That's why the reason why people say usually you have come to use the term society for explaining the community broadly meant, right? Society, that comes from Latin, and he stresses the concept of the societas, of the alliance, right? So it's as if there were always, in fact, a sodolis from the same etymology that we both into. Do you think to live in communities, even in sovereign states that are particularly solidal? I don't. I prefer the idea of community that is still also coming from Latin, and stresses more the fact that you have something in common, and this being having something in common can have various degrees, so much that I can have something in common with my family, with my neighbors, with people living in other cities, but even with people that live outside of my country, and that therefore are not under, for example, the political guidance of the military that would mobilize if there were a war in my country, and therefore I should also participate too as a citizen, at least in the political decision phase. And so, how does this sound, right? I think it's way more objective and better descriptive than reality, for which it is. I would say that society is something else. Society has, let's say, at least in this, if we consider society in the broader semantically as the ensemble, the whole community, whereas society paradoxically has a proper, or at least more current, and in my opinion appropriate usage, albeit deriving even from more away from its etymology, in the moment in which you attach it in fact to politics, to war, and to society in itself. Meaning what exactly? That society in this regard is properly what is connected to politics and warfare in the moment in which it does stick together to carry the thing out, right? Which is something that in the Culturalism Trinity takes in consideration the fact that every element of the Trinity is compenetrated by the other, and that it's indistinguishable from the other. Meaning what? That even a soldier, that in the Culturalism Trinity would correspond to the taste for gamble, that war, the risk war represents, and that is the one deputed to literally kill, because the purpose of war is practically translated in physically wiping out the enemy armed forces, is at the same time a member of the community, still as a civilian in some dimension, that he joined the military, but still within this community, in fact, and that therefore is part of society, because comes home and has a family and has a house and property and whatever, and that has a political will. That is the same reason, together with his social background, why he's a soldier, for example, in that army, and fighting and motivating it and making that political choice, which is not to be taken for granted. because where the value of the resistance would stand in countries that fought against, paradoxically, their same tyranny, or things like this. So the things are always dramatically more complicated, and in this sense, you understand how conflictual they are. So can you attribute, even descriptively, in an accurately scientific sense, say, to culture something so vague, or say very comprehensive, of course, but just vague, considering in fact all the elements that it comprehends, to culture, like the meaning of what war is fundamentally about, if you don't even study, in fact, the political, military, and social background itself. This is what von Clausewitz did. Instead, these imbeciles of culturalists came out with the idea, fundamentally, that there is some kind of strange innate, or we don't even know whether changeable or modifiable, or at least, even think about the value of individual redemption or growth or whatever. How do you explain that? Can culture determine how violent you are compared to violent? Normally not, because culture can provide you, let's say, in the narrow sense of folklore, anthropological values, beliefs, spirits, all these things. Let's say, of course, the moral, and in part also to attain the material sap that would motivate you to behave in a certain way. But a culture is not violent per se. It's violent as a community if it is pressured by a condition of warfare, and if that condition does not exist, they don't need to make war, and that word changes, that word. So how can you interpret war, just the idea that some the most violent and emotional elements of society, of the community, decide to make war for some reason? How do you put that with the rest of the people? Where does the struggle between these people occur? Why do you think that, I don't know, yes, a Celtic chieftain was a radically individualistic and voyeuristic mobster without the minimal human life? If you don't understand that the Celtic community as a whole worked, and why he was brought and needed to live like that, both for domestic and foreign needs, doesn't make any sense. You're basically de-evaluating that behavior, not to human intelligence, capacity, craftiness, capacity of adaptation, but to a sort of innate spirit that says this is just an imbecile who wanted to cut people to pieces for no reason. And that still today we make war because there are those people, and it's not really the case. It's not really the case. Von Clausewitz abundantly explains how this is actually the diametrically opposed of what it actually happens, and that actually speaks very much about the lack of civilization of the so-called culturalists, because civilization and the political element specifically that corresponds to the government is always the most rational. And we know in evolutionary biology this is the case, that we want competent, harsh, cold leaders to rule us, because they are the ones that have to make the most difficult of decisions without being becoming pathetic in the process, and leading us where while it's surrounded by danger towards the most lucidly, rationally calculated direction that we can think. That's why the Greeks had Athena as the true deity of war, and Ares was always defeated by her. That's why also the Germanic tribes had this terrifying practices in order to properly join the military brothers, etc. But in theory, the leaders, the elderly, the seniors would become appreciated for wisdom that was still part of actually that infused what the Latin would could furor, that was actually the same Wut, that was not blind fury, but it was actually a divine wisdom. It was inspired in this capacity of leading men, but in a more in that sense for the chieftain, at least still in a military sense, but primarily, of course, in a political sense. I mean, if you study history of religion, anthropology, everything that come close to the same culture, you realize that the Clausewitzian paradigm is absolutely scientifically correct, and that culturalism is just talking about puppets. I don't know what it is, and so if you really need and want and must learn the art of war and what you want to understand what warfare is historically and correctly, you have to start literally from zero. Hopefully, that's something that you don't need guides, you don't need gurus, you don't need strange figures. Von Clausewitz in itself is just a guide describing not an idea of war that von Clausewitz had in his own hand as a Clausewitzian war, but the actual description of real war on a scientific and moral base. Moral in the sense that it drives the unescapable connection between politics and war, as not war as something strange, mysterious that happens that is terrible for mankind and detached from any de facto human responsibility, as war is waged. It doesn't ravage by itself. A fire ravages by itself. War is carried out. There are human beings that are making it on purpose, and they're driven like hell because the reasons why they make it that are anti-preservational must be pretty damn convincing for making them go against their own instinct of self-preservation, and that is in fact a rational and not instinctive behavior, what is instead the culturalists of course do not understand, because they are the first ones who indulge in that kind of hubris and lack of clarity and of rationality and self-control. So starting from zero, meaning you should start, as always, we said this, there is no other way of becoming even minimally competent about warfare without studying step by step, sources at hand, completely, campaigns and battles. Not reading Ospreys, not listening to my videos, not doing others, but literally gathering all this. It can take months, even years, but until you do it, you will not understand. There is no way out of that. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. You can read all the books that you want. It will not work, because until you touch it, but properly, the historical reality through that reconstruction, you cannot understand. That is still what a general does, because the general has to reconstruct the battle after it was fought. It's not that, it's clear even at the moment in which it is being fought, and we will never fully know what happened, but when you start comparing them all, you start seeing the pattern there, and which will allow you also to complete likelihood also those gaps that you can't depict, and that were you to command an army would tell you essentially what to do, even though with a margin of risk, but still having an idea of what the dynamic can be, right? And at that point, it's mostly knowledge that you lack, but the intelligence and the determination there, and the courage, the meeting point of courage and intelligence is determination. Knowledge, let's say, better, but in that sense, properly in the capacity also of understanding it, right? That brings to one of the most appreciated intellectual command capacity, together with the same moral force that has to drive you in the first place. Excuse me, I drink a little. So you should start from. You can study warfare in this sense also disorderly in a chronological sense, but still covering the gaps. It's a bit what we do on Schwerpunkt here. But the point being still keeping track of the chronological evolution of the concept of strategy. That is, this is very important, because you can benefit, of course, from studies, from things written by other people, but it's important properly to be able to analyze it, even by scale, that say maybe the concept is not necessary, but understanding, unless you're particularly focused on theory, but let's say understanding the difference between size and Napoleonic army and one of just of 20 years before is crucial to understand the Napoleonic Wars. If you don't have the scale of that difference, you factually cannot understand what warfare was, even in Napoleonic times, why it was the way it did, and where the people coming from with that. Because the same moral forces that rendered it possible came from a political and social context that had not rendered it possible to wage war in the scale, the mass scale that the same Napoleonic Wars showed by themselves. So it's not; these are not fantasy, just in fact toy soldiers that are sent there with no ideas, with no thought, with no motivation. You cannot study war like that. So that's why culture is important, there is no doubt. But it passes exclusively through a perfect, first of all, military if you study war, but ever more necessarily and complementarily political and social sense. So then culturally, how many, again, history about, how many videos about history of religions or anthropology we make here? A lot, we need that. But why? Because these things reveal the political, social, and military axiom, and not for other strange reasons. This is, unfortunately, when we lack that diachronic and comparative capacity, we end up thinking that is instead the case, that you can study, I don't know, religion as something separated from these things. You cannot understand even religion if you don't study politics, war of society. Doesn't make any sense. Why would anything human make sense by detaching it as an abstraction from something else? That's why hyper-specialization is the proof of this lack of understanding, incapacity of understanding. It's an extremely serious thing, and nobody's actually fighting against this, because the main tide is, in favor of that, sadly enough. And yet we should reverse that. It's a strategic thinking within itself, if you think about it. So, another very important aspect of this story is that, of course, by studying, strategy, you should do it, of course, through the sources. So you shouldn't invent them. You shouldn't think that you can understand, in fact, a certain strategic context if you don't know the culture of that context. Meaning that you should know the entirety of that community per se, or at least as well as you can. And let's say finding in this strategic thought, as it was outlined at the time, points of contact, because that will reveal you exactly that these points in common are recurrent. And the reason why they're not recurrent is not because a people was culturally different from another, but because maybe a source was not enough intelligent to explain other points in common, to systematize them in a universal sense. That's why there is an evolution in this. You cannot compare Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz. It's dumb, right? And you cannot also pick Sun Tzu or von Clausewitz extrapolated from their context. Machiavelli's word Sun Tzu. And here, yet you don't hear this thing, right? Because most people factually don't even know what we're talking about. How many people do not know? Do know properly the political, military, and social context of Sun Tzu, of Machiavelli, or von Clausewitz, and they can't even bridge with other authors of how properly on strategy and how that concept evolved, and being able to measure it, in that diachronic order, and seeing how properly a concept is developed, and understand why von Clausewitz is relevant, and also understanding why after him there's none of that could match. Again, if you don't have a diachronic perspective, to you these are just things scattered in a vacuum with no connection, which is sadly enough how history is taught in the first place, because in part you can teach everything, but secondly, I have a very low opinion. I must say it without any regard about history teachers in general. And also much due to their politicization. You see, that's cultural in the sense that we do live in times where cultures can be dumber and more obnubilated than before. Surely this is the case for the context in which von Clausewitz wrote and the one culturalists write today. So even don't give for granted for any reason, because just the history of warfare will show you by itself that things always improve, right? There is an important element of human intelligence that, of course, doesn't forget something. Even if it appeared once, it kind of keeps track and memory of that. But it doesn't mean that, in fact, again, the political, military, or social conditions will always develop you at the point you can manage the same systems as they were more developed in the past at some point. This is true also in an individual sense, as we were saying at the beginning. Like, you're not a levy citizen of the of early 19th century France. part of the jeunesse dorée. You're not, right? You're most likely a lazy ass of the early 21st century who spent most of his time glued to a screen. That not mean that you can't do something positive with that, but chances are that, yeah, on average you won't do much positive with that anyway. And so that actually measures morally how much more aware, even of just of certain dimensions, you have to be if you want to understand history, and the effort of recognizing that you're not aware of them, which is very difficult when you're not aware at all of certain things as they existed. In any case, the points of contact are important because these will reveal you historically through many, like you don't even need a strategy treaty. You can need simply, sources and reconstructing battles and how they turn out to be that will show you that strategic humus, at least, and sap, and eventually properly culture in itself. You will be able to measure that. You will be able to say, even in condition of things that you don't know, you will be much more confident in making a hypothesis because lots of things you will have seen before. And you can come to say, look, something, for example, overly complicated military explanations normally are ahistorical because they, mostly warfare doesn't work like that at all. But it's difficult to explain without all the videos that we make about history, military history, because it doesn't, this doesn't make sense. You cannot see it until it substantiates itself through that historical knowledge. In this regard, there is another big point, that is the reasons, or the non-reasons, by the way, but still of the existence of debate between science and art of war, right? And I will not digress on this specifically, which, in a sense, if you know von Jomini and von Clausewitz, you know essentially what we're talking about, but still science is also, of course, included in any art, and vice versa. So even in there, it's even the presence of the debate and the forms that it takes that over time that reveals you even this sinusoidal trend in the capacity of understanding war that, again, do not seem to be particularly, in fact, the change over time, that are not always an improvement, that are not always clear. Of course, modern states know what war is, know how to make it, know how to wage it. But the point, practically, but that experience that is matured by actually doing it, and by actually even studying, in fact, real war as it existed, it's something else, right? As we were saying before, being a military man, that by itself doesn't make you an expert on warfare. It really does not, because it's another thing, right? You can be a military man, and fortunately, hopefully for you, never seen war in your lifetime, in your service at least. But that is, in fact, that there is an abyss between that and having gone at war, but also there is an abyss between being a frontline soldier and being a chief of staff general, because the scale of the understanding is completely different, and at different levels, as you understand, as well. So just think how difficult it is for naturally a civilian doing this, but for a civilian that properly doesn't even know history, to process this. The reason why military historians generally, it's very difficult to find, again, a military historian who's actually expert of the art of war, because actually it would cross out every from the group of military historians, of polymologists, anybody who doesn't actually study the art of war and just contents itself of studying war as a context and not knowing how it's waged, because at that point you lose any meaning, even in the context that you're studying. So even growing yourself aware of these fluctuations, of this historical changes, of the way the war effectively was waged in the various eras, is already by itself an incredibly committing work, right? It's extremely challenging. I think that not even a PhD thesis could aim at covering satisfactorily this topic, because where would you start from? Even just collecting the bibliography, it's enormous, right? So reason for which the best thing you can actually do in order to understand the art of war is studying history seriously for a lifetime, hopefully as a professional, adding, brick by brick in this great building that will take shape over the years. And it takes a lot. It takes decades. It's extenuating. It apparently doesn't reward you because it makes you feel ever more detached from other people who can't see any of this, but at the same time will give you much greater confidence and knowledge, and hopefully that can make you an example, and kind of a guide or a sort of at least of mentor for whoever is trying in the same enterprise, because he or she manages to understand how important this whole thing of war and the art of war actually is. So we'll hopefully resume again the military historical videos more often, and we will come back on military theory. So I really hope that also even such cryptic videos will be more understandable by themselves, which is already a challenge, understanding my videos. If you understand my videos, we have good chances, at least to start, thinking to understand the art of war, because my videos are so messed up that sometimes they look like a war by themselves, but for that matter. For today we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.